So my name is Rich Shefferson. I'm an associate professor here at U Tokyo, affiliated with the PEAK program, in particular in environmental sciences. So I'm going to moderate this panel discussion, question answer session, however we want to put it. Now, what I thought that we might start with is maybe a little test in critical thinking for all of us. And that is, because I think you, all of you came here with your own particular expertise and experience, where you teach and where you've been educated. Of course, we here are really fundamentally interested in how can we affect this university in particular and the Japanese education system as a whole. So I thought maybe we could focus a little bit on that, just to start out with. Maybe it'll dominate the discussion. I know from coming to these events that it sometimes does. Let me give you sort of a quick rundown from my perspective as an American who's actually taught in the system for 5 years now. Some of the key issues that we deal with within U Tokyo and within, I think, Japanese universities as a whole. And that is that when students come in here in a typical semester, particularly when they start, a typical student will be taking 12 to 16 classes at the same time. They will have about 23 contact hours over the course of the semester. In comparison, within the United States, we might take 3 or 4 courses with about 45 contact hours typically, but 60 in the case of, say, a laboratory or discussion course. Okay. So what that means is that just in terms of that time expectation in class, you have 2 times more here. Okay. On top of which you have the extra studying and everything else. Now what that does, I think it does a number of things from both the professor side and from the student side. From the student side, they can't be experts in everything, right? They can't actually attend everything even. Even our best students pick and choose. What are they going to be willing to take a C in, and what are they going to really put all of their efforts into to excel in? From the professor side, we have a lot less time on the one hand to lecture, which is the traditional teaching method here. So we have to think about how much time are we really going to put into exercises, and how much faith are we going to put into the final exam? The typical situation here is you take 13 lectures and then you take a final exam that's your only assessment for the course. Right? That's the system that we're working with here. So in my experience trying to bring in active learning perspectives, for example, trying to change how I work with this, I've certainly hit roadblocks because I can't put a lot of assignments on my students' shoulders, for one thing. And the Japanese government even has recommendations about maximum amounts of hours that students should be spending on assignments. So there's that aspect. That, of course, limits the amount of, say, active learning exercises that might come with assignments and so forth that we might do. There's also an expectation, I think, from the transparency side, that because it's nothing but lecture and a final exam at the end, that if you do happen to give a student an assignment, it's going to be out of left field. They're not going to be used to it. So I thought we might start with this general situation. I don't want to sound very negative about this. I'm not, there are certainly a lot of positives to the system that I have seen over the years. But I think this is the reality that we're dealing with in trying to change the system. I'm curious how you think we might go about working with this system instead of just dramatically changing everything, which I would love to do, but we can't. What can we do in these classes to actually integrate, the wonderful perspectives that you've brought today? And maybe each of you could actually address this. I don't know in what order you might like to go, but
I can start because is this on? I think it is. Years back, I was in Adelaide, Australia, and I was working with some physiology professors who had a very similar system, which was lecture, 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 final exam. And the change that I persuaded them to make was to have a couple smaller formative assessments along the way. Now, your class time is very limited here, it sounds like. You do not have many classroom hours, and so that's valuable. And this might be a place where technology comes in. And you might have, maybe 5 quizzes online at your own time, and that counts for 10% of the class, something small, 5% of the class. but it's just a little mechanism to check your knowledge to see if you're on track. Because one of the things that we encountered is that the Aussie students at week 10 out of week 15, they didn't know where they were at. Where am I in relation to the expectations of the course? But just by giving some little formative quizzes along the way, they could get a self-check. Am I good at this or am I lost? So that's one recommendation.
So I'm fascinated by this challenge you have of the limited amount of time in class for any one class, given that students take so many classes. And I hear your concern that you have a limited amount of time to deliver information. So you hesitate to reduce that time by adding in active learning. And that's a concern that we hear a lot from professors in the United States as well, that you need to reduce the delivery time in order to increase the active learning time. And that's a sacrifice for the delivery. But in my mind, I would say that this puts a more critical importance on the time of on what's happening inside that class time. And in fact, if students, as you say, are choosing what courses to work on and what courses to not work hard on, then the only way you really know that students are actively thinking about your content is when they are in the room with you, in the classroom. So I would even say that it's most important, I would say, have students actively address the content of your course. Have them question and struggle and work together. Whenever you are planning to lecture about a concept which they absolutely must understand and master to succeed in the course. So pick out those concepts where a student cannot succeed in your course if they don't master this concept. Then don't just lecture about that concept, because lecturing does not equal the student's mastery. It just means that you spoke for a while. And you don't know that students mastered that until you watch them discuss it and grapple with it and apply what you said, that concept, to some new situation that you could invent for them, and watch how they apply your lesson to that new situation. That is the only way you know that they got the content, that they mastered the concept. And if you can't watch it happen, you don't know it's happening until it's too late on the final exam. So I think the limitation of the amount of time you have with students makes it even more important to shepherd those students through the process of mastering the content, making sure that that happens.
I'm not sure if I really have an answer. I think, drawing from my experience in South Africa, we are trying to rethink seriously the issue of summative assessment. And the lady was speaking here in my video there, those who are there, with the colored dress. She's our new VC, new Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town. And now she has made call that we need to rethink seriously about the whole issue of assessment, whether we have to depend mainly on summative assessment, which is done at the end of the semester, or really we need to invest more on formative assessment, which I think goes along with active learning. So that don't have to wait. Of course, I mean, with our situation, it's because of the instability in the system, where sometimes the exams are disrupted, and then if students don't write exam, then you know that you've lost the whole semester. So I think I don't know how you can build in. I mean, I think the other have really given good inputs, that built-in formative assessment as part of active learning, so that at least the weight of assessment does not only rest at the end of the semester or the term.
So maybe I should focus on the course we have with Thomas Lenofos with Uppsala University. And as Thomas mentioned, from both sides actually, both at Uppsala University and Tokyo University, our students complain about that they had not enough time to focus on the case studies, and that the assignments were far too heavy for them. So we had to adjust, and finally, even if we know, we perfectly know that especially at the University of Tokyo Komaba, students are very busy with courses, and the same for PIC students. Even if we know that, it was for us necessary to be remembered by our students complaining that they have too much to do in a very short period of time. So we had basically to adjust and to find other ways to deal with that. And so for the next semester, we decided to reduce, for example, for the legal aspects, I was basically asking 3 questions on top of many other questions from the other side, and that was too much. So I decided just to focus on one question, knowing that in the classroom and during the discussion we should be able to elaborate and to mention about other topics. And I will be back a little to your own presentation, and I realized that for sure, for me at least, it would be the best way to make the best of our time, my time and a student's time. So to make clear from the beginning what I expect from them, and to make clear about the purpose, which was not that clear. And during your presentation, I mean, we focus on students, but I can say that for me, it was not, my expectations basically was not that clear at the beginning of the semester. Through the semester and during the process, I progressively make clear what I was expecting actually from the students, what the purpose of such legal perspective. We are talking about proposing students to reflect on the legal perspectives, but what does it mean exactly? What is the purpose of teaching environmental law, the legal perspectives, to students who are not planning to specialize and to become legal experts? So that was for me a real reflective effort to reflect again on what am I expecting from the students and what the purpose of this legal perspective is. And if it is more explicit, if it is clear from the beginning, then I guess that through the assignments too become clearer, and it's a gain of time.
And I could add, I think that this framework of purpose, task, criteria applies and is being applied to many, many aspects of higher education. So we talked about using it in the context of an assignment, like a homework assignment, but it would equally apply to active work that would happen inside of a class. That's an assignment. Almost any time you ask a student to do something, that's an assignment. So anything that's not absorbing a lecture is work. And if we know that you can't really depend that students would do homework, because they might choose to let your class slip because it's not one of the 10 that are their top priority. And if you know that there's little homework and there's one exam at the end, then the students might not even know how well am I doing as a student until the very end, which brings back this idea of formative assessment. If it's not happening inside the structure of the system, then the only place to put it is in the class meetings. That's the only place you have that you can control, where you would insert some coaching or some feedback or some formative assessment, so students could do some thinking inside the class and get your feedback, and then be aware metacognitively, here's how I'm doing, here's how I'm learning, right? So.
2 things here. First, I agree. Ideally, you do the formative assessments in the classroom, because then you can monitor and coach. But again, you have very limited class time, and so you got to just plan carefully. But I was, suddenly thinking about the opposite end of the spectrum. In the state of Iowa, there's a college called Cornell College, not Cornell, New York. They have one class a month, one class for 4 weeks. That's all the students have is one class. And then the instructor, the professor, has total control of 24 hours a day. That's the only thing they're doing is one class. So that's the other end of the spectrum.
I have a feeling the Japanese government won't allow that. So part of the problem that we have here, and I think this is true in all of your institutions as well, is that there's obviously some resistance to making changes to classes, but some of that resistance is simply inertia. That all of us are professors, we're busy, it takes a lot of time and effort to rethink these things. How do we incentivize making these sorts of changes? I imagine that in some of your cases, your universities might have actually incentivized. So I'm curious, do you have any thoughts? For the professors, but that's where the change has to come, I think, right?
Well, in order to make change, you initially have to be dissatisfied with the current condition. You yourself have to be somewhat dissatisfied that this isn't working as well as I would like it to, and then being open to an option, being open to a change. But if a professor is just saying, this is the way I've always done it, I'm happy, 50% graduate, 50% don't, or they pass, it's very difficult to make someone change if they're happy, if they're content in their ways. But if there's a number of professors around that are going, something's not working here, then you have openings. But how do you create that dissatisfaction is a good question. It's just like, how do you make somebody change their mind or change their habits? That's tough.
I think Professor Itatsu suggested the beginnings of that dissatisfaction, or some data that identifies that dissatisfaction. If students in a large survey are saying the amount of communications with professors is not adequate, or something to that effect, then there's some dissatisfaction out there. And if, as you say, some of the finances of an institution depend on student tuition, then the dissatisfaction of students is something that leadership would pay attention to. So in this case, you have a situation where you might invite the leadership, like deans, for example, of the various different colleges. You could ask them to nominate a faculty member, each of them, who might have the honor of connecting with a group of like-minded faculty who want to address this concern of the students. And together with leaders like the Global Faculty Development Center or staff, you might do a pilot study. And if that pilot study, for example, included some of the most respected research faculty on the campus, who then tried this out and watched what happened and summarized it and reported on it and gave a panel presentation about it, people would go listen to them. And then maybe they'd write it up as a publication, which would help you address the challenge that Professor Sujimori talked about earlier when he couldn't find Japanese scholarship on aspects of teaching and learning. Like, that would generate some scholarship. But I think you have conditions that could begin to move you toward more solutions in this area, because both students and leaders could now be incentivized to address a dissatisfaction and a small pilot effort at change.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's a big challenge. If I can speak from, again, our context, our Center for Higher Education Development is one of the oldest in South Africa. It was established in the 1980s. So far, it's the only unit that has survived in terms of academic development work and scholarship. In all the other universities, that initiatives have really collapsed. So what we've learned over the years is that it's very difficult to convince lecturers sometimes to follow some of your ideas. Now, what we have learned now as a faculty is to structure ourselves in a way that we we regard ourselves as the collaborators. In fact, the slogan that we always say is that it's called CHED. CHED, do it in other people's gardens. So that means we practice our expertise in the faculties. So there are various the model is very dynamic. In certain faculties, we have education development unit that works collaboratively with the staff members there. So in other words, you demonstrate good practice. So they see, if the lecturer could say, I'm having a problem with this course, students are failing and not doing very well. Now, a staff member from my unit who has been trained in educational development will work alongside with that colleague. And then until maybe the colleague says, oh, this is a good practice. So for example, I mean, this whole concept of active learning. So again, this is something that we really need to role play across unit. If from one case study that I have, we can move again to another faculty, a few more people from us working together with so, but that process is very slow because I mean it's carrot, it's bottom up, which is very, very slow. Recently, the university has appointed a DVC, teaching and learning now. So at least the new DVC is emphasizing the issue of teaching and learning excellence. So if your students are not performing, there is accountability from the top. But then we need to provide the support. So I think, I mean, stick and carrot, that's what now we are having. You can encourage, but at the same time, there might be something from the top that's saying, no, things are not going on well in your course.
I'll add one real quick thing. The stick at the University of Minnesota was a little bit students, but more so the parents. I don't want my child in a 900 student auditorium, listening to some graduate student talking. That's not good enough. But the parents put pressure on. And so that, I don't know if it's going to happen here because you've got a lot of good things going on at your university. You are already kind of top. So how do you change if you're happy with where you're at?
The parental sort of intrusion on that is a foreign concept here, but it happens within PEAK, interestingly enough. So within our program, we have had some experience with that. Well, maybe to put that question, this might be kind of the last thing I can ask here in our time.
Rich?
Yeah.
You didn't ask me?
Oh, sure. Sorry.
So maybe it's probably because I'm from Tokyo University. No, just there's insatisfaction, but there's not only insatisfaction. So in my position, I have access to just a few places, and I can reflect only from the bottom-up perspective. But from the bottom-up perspective, so it's possible to become more aware of existing insatisfaction in the classroom through the discussions we have with the GFD, FD lunch, with colleagues also. I have actually on an individual basis many discussions with colleagues, and then through these discussions it's possible to become more aware of existing insatisfaction, but at the same time it's really possible also to brainstorm and to try to have a good and maybe winning ideas. So there's a lot to do from the bottom-up perspective, even if I'm not I don't have any power, but still I still believe in the power of insatisfaction transformed in good ideas. And maybe if good ideas are heard here and here, maybe we can hope that progressively they will reach the top of the hierarchy. But again, a strong emphasis on the need for these collective discussions, and many of which actually start in the classroom, and knowing that our students, being the first concerned, have many good ideas, including the curriculum itself. And we are going to reflect precisely in a few weeks on these good ideas through a seminar we have with colleagues trying to reflect on the existing curriculum and possible ways to adapt it and to transform it.
So last question, and then I'll hand it back to Professor Woodward over there for the final remarks. Is there any value to pure lecture? Yes, pure lecture. A course that is taught essentially entirely through lecture. That's the traditional model. That's what a lot of people defend. Yeah. So is there any value to that?
Storytelling, it's just, it could, if you want to learn how to tell stories, you listen to somebody tell stories and you kind of mimic them. But, there's you know, the history of higher education involves lecture. Have we created some good products? Yeah. You know, but we've been filters. We've filtered out a lot of good talent. There's many, many, many students out there that could be biologists, but we've filtered them out. We said, go away. But we only want the easiest students to teach. You know, that's who we want in our rooms, are the easy ones, and we'll take credit for their accomplishments too. But the history is we've been more filters than pumps. We're trying to improve that. We're trying to help more students succeed in our classroom. That's a tough question. You know, how do you know, I don't buy the notion that every student can succeed. You know, I think that's a lie that, you know, educators sometimes say, and it's just not realistic. You know, some people can't do science, and so you just got to start there. But more can do science than are currently doing science. That's my position. But yeah, there's history of success, but we can do better.
To answer that, I think, you know, the context has changed with technology, because the lecturer is no longer the source only. You know, there are many other sources. In the past, you know, as a professor, you'll be the only source. If you've got a textbook, students will know that this is the only source that you have. When you speak, they take notes. But now they have got many other sources. I mean, you know, they've got other ways. I was just talking about, telling Mari about the situation. One lecturer at our university was complaining that the students are not coming to class because they were doing lecture recordings. And they were not coming. He said, no, I don't know, since I started lecture recording, students don't come. And one day he went out on lunch and he found a big group of students, and only to find that they're discussing his recording, but they don't want to come and listen to it, but they want to discuss him outside the class. So I think we are competing with many other sources of information, where I don't think it's a question of whether, I think it's a question of adapting or die. If you don't adapt as a lecturer, you want to continue with the traditional way of teaching, I think that we definitely will be left behind. There will be other sources where students are learning from. Yeah.
We've been replaced by YouTube.
Yes.
Just a short word on lecture. It's one thing to give a lecture in a specific department. For example, as a legal scholar, I could give a lecture in law schools or faculties of law, but here I'm working in environmental interdisciplinary environment, which implies to deliver lectures a bit differently. So I'm perfectly aware of the importance and the significance of active learning processes, but at the same time, in my own courses this semester, I'm planning to deliver short interactive lectures, plus, of course, working on specific activities, so-called active learning activities. But I still put some value in these so-called short interactive lectures, knowing that they are given in a specific teaching and learning environment, which is not monodisciplinary. And from my perspective, at least, it changes a lot because it obliges me to be self-reflective and critical a little bit. So the way to deliver lectures depends also on the space in which you deliver it.
I would say in a context like this, to completely do away with lectures is unreasonable. That won't happen. Lectures can be stimulating and wonderful. Many of us learned and got our degrees through a mainly lecture-based system. Lectures come from a long tradition where initially they were the internet. Right? Yeah. They were the source of information. You would go to the lecture to get the information, right? But as you say, we now compete with many sources of information. If we know that students are watching, or gathering information online, then we are competing with that. And we need to deliver something as institutions of higher education. We need to deliver something of high value. Sometimes that comes in the form of a lecture, but it doesn't always 100% of the time any longer come in the form of a lecture. And lectures don't appeal to all styles of learners. We have weeded out a vast multitude of productive members of the society of the future by only teaching in a way that appeals to some small segment of them. but just as a model of how it's not that difficult, right? I mean, I myself this afternoon lectured to you for a while. I gave you some research results. I could have continued to lecture. I could have said, here's sample A, here's the revised version, this is how they're different, go do it. But would you really have felt the struggle of the student trying to figure out the purpose of the assignment or how to do it or what it would look like if it was done well? You'll remember that example in a way that you would not remember it if I had just told you the answer, if I had just lectured it to you. It was a small change. It didn't transform everything that I would have done if I had just lectured, but it was a small change that will make a difference to how much you remember. And if you can make a small change every day to a lecture like that, or each time you lecture, that kind of a small change gives the students something to hang on to and remember and to use and to apply. You'll now go out, I hope, and do something with that understanding. And your students could similarly go do something and apply the knowledge you're giving them. One thing a lecture cannot do is provide students with the skills to solve unscripted problems of the future. The way to acquire skills is to practice skills. You must practice doing them. So just give the students a few minutes to practice thinking or doing some skill that you know will help them become the most effective possible leaders for solving society's problems in the future. Just a couple of minutes can make the big difference.
Well, thanks very much to our panel here and to all of you for listening to us